Hello everybody and welcome back to week 2 of INFOST 440. I hope everybody had a good Labor Day weekend and had a good first week of the fall semester. Typically I record these videos on Friday. I'm going to be out of town this coming weekend, so I'm recording this video just a little bit earlier. Today's actually Labor Day. It's a pretty nice day, a little bit of rain, but I figured it'd be a good time to get the materials posted and get the videos recorded. So yeah, just a couple of other announcements before we get started with this week's content. I did create a link on the homepage to the class lounge. I realized that wasn't showing up. So under miscellaneous resources, you'll see me post a couple of things here. So currently I have a class lounge. If you click on this, it'll take you to a discussion area for our class lounge. You can post whatever you want in here. If you have just general questions, things you find online that you might want to share with the class. It's kind of lounge space, so you can use it however you want. I'll probably also put on here sometime later today some examples of some final projects that students have done in past semesters. So if you're kind of curious what you might potentially want to make for your final project or what you might end up making, I can post a couple of links under there as well. So just wanted to let you know that there's going to be an area you're going to see here now called miscellaneous resources that'll include the class lounge and some other things that don't necessarily fit into one specific week for our class. So what are we going to be talking about this week? Well, we're going to be talking about some exciting things. We're going to have a very brief review of HTML and CSS. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, as I know everybody has been in 240, but I just wanted to touch on some resources, especially if you need to brush up, to hopefully help you get up to speed, because we're also going to be diving into your first bits of PHP. And this week and next week is going to be a little bit more mellow in terms of the stuff we're going to be doing. But by week 4, it's going to be really important you have a solid foundation with HTML and you really kind of understand the basics of the PHP scripting language, because things are going to start getting more difficult during week 4. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that is going to be coming. So yeah, let's get started with some basic HTML review. So I mentioned this a little bit last week, but it's going to be really important for this class that you have a good foundation with HTML and CSS. If it's been a while since you've taken INFOST 240 or you're not too confident with your skills, some resources that I've used in the past and I've recommended in the past would be W3 Schools, Code Academy, and lynda.com. There are a lot of other places you can learn or brush up on HTML online, but these are probably the best. In the discussion, you might find someone post something else, so definitely feel free to check those out as well. Again, W3 Schools is mostly a site that has a lot of examples on it. So if you're like, how do I make a table with HTML? You can go to W3 Schools, and they sort of teach you by example. Code Academy teaches you by sort of challenging you with short exercises. And then lynda.com, if you like watching videos and following videos, is pretty awesome. They have a lot of really great video tutorials that you can follow. And they're produced, actually, they're really good quality. So you can also check out lynda.com. I wonder if this link actually works. I should probably change this link. Let's see. It does kind of work. Yeah, you can access lynda.com through these instructions here. Good. So I'm glad that still works. In addition to those resources that you can use to sort of brush up on HTML and CSS, I also want to give you a couple of tips and hints that I think have helped me if I'm trying to learn or figure out how something is built. I think I mentioned last week I learned most of my HTML, CSS, and PHP skills on my own before I came to the university, just by essentially looking at source code and sort of reverse engineering it. I think that's a great way to learn as well. So here's a few helpful tips. First one is in Chrome or Firefox. There's 2 ways you can view HTML source code. If you're in Chrome, I typically tend to use Chrome. The shortcut to do that is Control-U if you're on a PC, and that'll bring up the site's HTML source code. You can also right-click and say View Page Source, and that'll come up. That option should be available whether you're in Mac or Windows. You can right-click again and say View Page Source. In addition, there's also this Inspect tool. This is kind of an interesting tool that you can play around with. Essentially, this will allow you to change, kind of temporarily, the HTML code or CSS code on a site. So you can sort of play around with the code on someone else's website and see what happens when you make changes. The changes that you make aren't reflected for everybody in the whole world. It's just kind of like a temporary copy on your computer. So you don't have to worry about permanently screwing up someone's website. You're not going to do anything that's too bad. So yeah, I definitely recommend looking at the source code of different sites if you're kind of curious, like, hey, how did they get that table centered in that specific area of the site? You can look at the source code and try to figure it out. A lot of times you're going to find that a site's source code, especially from like bigger, well-known sites like Google or UWM or Facebook, if you look at their source code, it's going to be kind of a mess. There's going to be a ton of stuff in there because a lot of their site is automatically been essentially curated or rendered. So there can be a lot of stuff that's kind of overwhelming, but we're going to actually work on an assignment this week. So if you want to kind of figure out how I did my assignment example, if you want to look at the HTML source code, you can do that. And obviously with my assignment example, it's much more scaled down. It's not going to be as crazy looking as if you look at the source code for the university site or for Google, where they have a content management system that generates a lot of the code that is displayed. So again, right click, view page source, or inspect. Available in Chrome, Firefox, I'm sure it's also in Safari, and really any other major browser should have those features available. So it's going to be important though that you understand when you view a page source code from the browser, you're only going to be able to see any of the front end code. You're going to be able to see the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. What you're not going to be able to see is any of the server-side code that is rendered and processed on the server itself. So what is a server-side code or scripting language? Well, that's going to be things like PHP or SQL. You're not going to see any of that when you right-click on a website and click View Page Source. In order to view that code, you're going to need to have essentially administrative access to an account or the server so you can download that code and look at the actual PHP source code before it's processed on the server. And we're going to be diving more into that this week. So just be mindful that when you're looking at a page source code, you're only going to see essentially the HTML and CSS and JavaScript. You're not going to see any PHP, MySQL, or any other server-side scripting language that exists like ASP.NET, Cold Fusion, etc. So just be mindful of that. You're only going to see the front-end languages. You're not going to see anything that's ran server-side. I mentioned last week that it's going to be important that you know how to make tables and work with forms for this class. PHP, which is what we're going to be spending a lot of time on in this class, will allow you to make your websites dynamic. So essentially it allows you to take a static page and make it dynamic, right? So what is a dynamic website? Essentially, it's a website that changes based on variables or based on how users interact with the site. So you're essentially going to be able to build applications or dynamic sites where users can input data through a form. As an example, let's say you were to register for a website. The site's going to ask you for a username and a password and maybe some other information. And you're going to type that into the page on an HTML form, right? So that form is then going to just essentially take that data and then send it to a PHP script, which is going to process it and potentially save it into a database, etc. And that's why it's important to know the form piece really well. And then I think knowing how to create tables is also going to be really important because probably eventually you want to take that information that users have submitted and that is currently stored in the database and display it on a page and display it organized on a page. And you can do that using a table or using div tags or any other means to format data. But I think using a table is probably the easiest, especially when you're first starting off and learning. So tables are going to be important as well. So here's just a really basic table example. There are more on W3 schools that you can check out. But again, tables are going to be important, as will be forms. So how deep do you need to understand forms? Actually, you probably need to know a good amount about forms. So you definitely want to understand how a form is built in HTML and what the various form field types do. So you want to know and have the ability to create things like text fields, text areas, drop-down menus, radio buttons, checkboxes. Doing hidden form fields as well would be nice, but it's not required. So it's going to be important you know how to do those things. I know you probably only spent like a week of working with forms in INFOST 240, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about forms when we get to them in a little bit more depth during week 4. But again, it's going to be important. If you have time now, definitely brushing up on forms is going to be a huge help. Again, not only just knowing how to make a basic form, but knowing how to use all the different form field types. Text areas and text boxes are going to be important, but also, again, things like drop-down menus, radio buttons, etc., etc. radio buttons, checkboxes, and I have some examples in here. But again, you can reference W3 Schools or Code Academy if you want some specific examples. I don't want to bore everybody going over that stuff again and again. So again, yeah, just take a look at W3 Schools. If you need any suggestions, if you want me to sort of vet how well you're doing, if you sort of explain, kind of what you know how to do, what you don't know how to do yet, I can either point you in the right place to, brush up on specific things, or I can be honest with you and sort of assess how ready you're going to be for this class and tell you how much you really need to work in the next week or two to brush up to make sure you're going to be in good shape for when we get to week 4 and things are going to get more difficult. So if you want me to sort of help assess where you currently are, just send me an email, kind of explaining how you feel you know how to make forms and tables and what you're still not too sure about, and I can sort of point you in the right direction or tell you that everything's going to be fine if you're already I would say at a good spot. So feel free to ask me if you want any specific suggestions or you want me to sort of vet how ready you're going to be for this class and how worried you should be about brushing up over the next week or two. In this class, it's going to be very, very important that you comment all of your work. So you've learned how to do HTML and CSS comments in INFOST 240, and you probably learned how to do commenting in INFOST 350. Commenting is going to be really important, especially if let's say you're struggling with your assignments and you don't get it 100% done, or it's not working 100% correctly. Having those comments in there can be a lifesaver. So even if things aren't really working as they should be, or if they're not super intuitive how it should work, you can put some nice detailed comments in your site or in your application explaining what's supposed to happen or how things are supposed to work. So that way when I'm grading them, I'll have a better sense of what you're trying to accomplish. Outside of this class, comments are really important if you get a full-time job doing any type of development work or scripting, because you're probably not going to be working on something completely by yourself, but you're going to be working in a team. So commenting is going to be really important down the road, especially with teamwork, so that way your teammates or your coworkers will understand what you're building, why you're building it in specific ways, and it's going to be really easy for them or easier for them to go back and make sense of your work if you ever were to leave and they have to change something years down the road. So again, commenting is going to be very important. It's going to be really, really important that you do it in all your assignments for this class. If you don't put enough comments in, you are going to lose points on your assignments and on your project. So please make sure you comment as often as you possibly can, at least several comments per page or per script. So that way it's easy for me to understand what you're trying to do, and it gets you into the habit of making comments, which again are important for a number of reasons. Next, I wanted to talk about file paths. I'm sure you talked a little bit about these in INFOST 240, but I think it'd be good to touch on them again now. Because when we get later on in the semester, you're going to be developing more complicated scripts and more complicated applications that are more than just one PHP file. There are going to be several files that are linked together. When we start doing that, it's going to be really important you have a sense of the different type of file paths that exist and how they differ from one another. So there are essentially two different ways you can create or reference a file path when you're programming. The first one is called an absolute file path, and then the second one is relative. They're both pretty interchangeable, but the way that you build a file path or reference a file is going to be different depending on whether you want to use an absolute or relative path. So just keep that in mind that they both can do the same thing, but the way that they work can be different. So what is an absolute file path? Well, an absolute file path essentially references a complete path that is static to a directory or a file on the internet. Typically, this will include the protocol if you want someone to access an external resource, such as like a different web page. You'd want to make sure that file path had HTTP in it. And it's going to be complete. You're going to have a domain, you're going to have a folder, and then you're going to have the file. So again, absolute paths are necessary if you want someone to access a resource on an external site. The other kind of file type or path is called a relative path. Relative paths are nice because you don't have to type as much, right? So it's generally easier to type out the file path, and they can be dynamic. So it allows your website or your application to be dynamic, and you can essentially can allow it to change and modify. You can modify it easier down the road. The one downside to working with relative file paths is they can be more complicated to build and to understand. So that's the one disadvantage. But once you understand relative file paths, they're generally better to use when you can use them. They will allow you to make your applications more flexible, more dynamic, and also will allow you to future-proof them a little bit more. So next, I'm going to give you some specific examples of absolute and relative file paths, and I'm going to explain the differences in a little bit more detail. So if you're looking at, let's say, some HTML source code, and you're looking at a hyperlink, obviously you're going to see the A and then the href, and then you're typically going to see a path or a link. So you're going to know if you're working with an absolute file path if you see the protocol listed. So if you're looking at some HTML source code and you see a href and you see HTTP or HTTPS, then you know the path you're looking at is absolute. It's to a specific website that is going to load irregardless if anything on the site changes. So as an example, if I have a site called like jamesschultz.com and I have a hyperlink to it, and then I decide to change my name. Like let's say I get married or something along those lines, and I want to change my name and I get a different domain. With an absolute file path, all the links will break unless I manually go through and update them. If I go and say, let's say I change my name from James Schultz to James Smith, I'd have to go around and find every single reference of jamesschultz.com and replace it with jamessmith.com if I were to change my name, because the path is absolute. It's a static path. If you want to change it, you have to go through every single line of code that references it and manually make the change. Again, it's a fixed, static, not variable path. If you want to link or reference files or resources from an external site, you have to use an absolute path, because you essentially have to reference the domain and a specific directory for the user to go to or for the script to link in with if it's outside of your account. Relative paths work a little bit differently. So if you're looking at the source code of a website and you notice that the link just references a file or a folder and a file like profile.jpg or pictures/profile.jpg, then you know you're working with a relative path. A relative path is not going to have a protocol in front of the path, and it's not going to have a domain. So relative paths are nice because they're dynamic. So like let's say you have a site, let's say I have a site called jamesschultz.com. And on jamesschultz.com, I have my profile picture linked to the homepage. It's in a subfolder called pictures. So I would have on the homepage a link to pictures/profile.jpg. I could have my domain name be whatever I want. So I could change my domain name from James Schultz to James Smith, and it's not going to break anything, because all my links are referencing just the directory and the picture. They're not referencing the full file path. So it allows your site to be a little bit more dynamic. So that's one of the nice things about relative file paths. Relative paths, though, can get a little bit more complicated because if you want to start referencing things in different folders, you have to understand where the path is in relation to what's trying to access it. So as an example, if you look at my web space through FileZilla, let me see if I can connect to my account. Come on, FileZilla. Wrong password. If you go to public HTML, then we see my file. So when you work with relative file paths, you have to understand the root of what you're accessing it from. So as an example, the root of my website for the student web space is shul253.udemsoas.com. So if I go to the root of my web space, this is the root, right? So One thing to understand though is the root of my domain, or sorry, the root of my account is under /public HTML / then you're at the root of my account. So the root of my account is different than the root of my domain because my account starts at / and then my account files are essentially under public HTML, but the root of my domain is starting with public HTML. So as an example, I don't think I have any picture on here, unfortunately. If I were to look at the source code for my assignment, you're going to notice that my links are just part2.php and php-info. So these are relative file paths. If I had separate subfolders, like let's say I had a subfolder called scripts, I would have to add in scripts / part2.php. So again, relative file paths are a little bit more complicated to work with. When we start going into working with multiple PHP scripts, probably later on in the semester, maybe starting around week 7 or 8, when you reference different PHP scripts, you have to use essentially a different file path if you want to reference them using a relative path. So it gets even more complicated. But for at least this week, the good place to start out is just understanding that there are two different types of file paths that can be used, relative and absolute, and the way that they work is a little bit differently. So over the next week or two, if you can sort of test yourself and try to identify relative links and absolute links and understand the differences, that'd be a good place to start for the next week or two. Because we are going to dive more into this when we start getting into more complicated scripting languages and building more complicated PHP scripts. So now in the next section of this lecture, we're going to start talking about what LAMP servers are and how they operate. So I mentioned a couple of times that you're going to essentially be learning how to build web applications using PHP and MySQL. So PHP is a server-side scripting language. MySQL is essentially a type of database server. So the way these languages and servers operate, they essentially all run on one physical server, and essentially one it's actually virtual. So let me step back and say they all run on one virtualized server in an environment known as a LAMP environment. So LAMP is actually an acronym that stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. So this acronym essentially describes the core components of the server, all the different tools and software applications that are installed on the server in order to make it work and functional. So first off, we have Linux, which is the server's operating system. So if you haven't heard of Linux before, Linux is essentially the operating system of the server that runs all the core components. So Linux is essentially another version of Windows or Mac OS. So I'm sure you've heard of Windows and Mac OS. They're operating systems you can put on your computer or on your laptop. Linux is essentially the third option that exists out there. So Linux is a free operating system. It's open source. So what does that mean? It means anybody can download and install Linux without having to purchase it. So the idea of open source software is essentially means it's developed by a community and it's published for free. Anybody can run it, download it, install it, and modify it. So the source code for Linux is available open source online. So you can download and tweak the source code. What's really cool about that, you can run Linux on just about anything because you can modify it to suit your needs. So people have modified Linux to run on things like old cell phones. I used to run Linux on my iPod Video back in the day. Game consoles, fridges, pretty much anything. Any computer can have Linux installed on it. So Linux is essentially broken out into different distributions. So if you hear like someone talk about a Linux distro or Linux distribution, they're essentially talking about the version of Linux or the flavor of Linux. Like as an example, we might have Windows 10 or Windows 7, but in the Linux world, there's different versions. There's hundreds of different versions that exist out there called distributions. So on our server, we're actually running CentOS. So that's the server distribution that we're running. But there are other ones that exist out there as well. A popular one that you might have heard of, like Ubuntu or Red Hat, Debian, Fedora, etc. There are many that exist out there. And again, you can download these completely for free. So if you go and you say, Google like a CentOS download, you can go to the CentOS website. You can download this and install it on any computer. Free, no licensing that's needed. So it's pretty awesome. So those are all the advantages to using Linux. The disadvantages would be because it's free and open source, there isn't really a company that's responsible for it. So if you're running this for your organization and you run into trouble and you need help or support, there isn't really any help or support that exists out there. You can definitely talk to the community. There's a huge community of Linux users and they run different discussion forums. They have different subreddits. So if you need help with Linux, there's plenty of resources to find it, but there's not like one number you can typically call, which is different than Microsoft or Mac OS. We can call Apple or Microsoft and get help if you run into issues with their products. With Linux, it's made by a bunch of guys in the basement programming away. So if it doesn't work, they're like, well, it's free. We gave it to you. You can fix it yourself. But there's generally not a whole lot of support that's going to be available or readily reliable. To sort of fill that gap, there are different companies that will offer support for Linux. They're essentially a third-party support. So there might be an independent company that has nothing to do with the development of the software that'll offer help and support to companies that might need it. So there are still options out there. Just be aware that Linux is completely free, completely open source, but the sort of the catch-22 with that is that there isn't any one-stop support resource that's necessarily available for Linux distributions. Linux runs on probably over half of the world's servers. Again, because it's free and open source, Linux runs on and essentially powers most of the internet. So it's kind of cool to think about. This thing that you probably are not super familiar with yet is really popular and powers most of the internet. It's kind of crazy to think about because most people only know of Apple's Mac OS and Microsoft's Windows desktop. They think that's it, and that's probably running the internet. Well, that's not the case. Linux here is really taking a big part of the show. So Linux is the L in LAMP. Well, what if you wanted to run Apache, MySQL, and PHP with Windows? You could certainly do that. That's what's known as a WAMP server. So it's definitely possible to install these other components, Apache, MySQL, and PHP on Windows. And when you do that, it's called a WAMP. So again, a lot of the software is highly customizable. You can run it on Linux. You can run it on Windows. You can even run it on most of the stuff on Mac OS. So it's kind of interesting to know that you can run it on different platforms. So now, what's the A in LAMP stand for? Well, the A in LAMP stands for Apache. So Apache is the web server that supports our environment. So this is the part that serves up HTML pages. So if you wanted to have a standalone web server that just had Linux and Apache, you could definitely do that. But you probably wouldn't be having or hosting any dynamic websites on the server. There'd be static websites that look very similar to something you might find in the 1990s. There's going to be single pages. They're not going to be anything dynamic. They're going to be probably pages that you made in INFOST 240, static standalone pages that ran. These are going to be HTML and CSS documents. So Apache serves out the HTML and CSS documents, so kind of keep that in mind. It's free and open source. It runs over half the world's websites. It's incredibly popular. There are other paid versions of web servers that you can use, like Microsoft has their IIS. I believe Oracle also has a service as well. So there are other paid web servers that exist. There are also other open source ones as well, but Apache is the most popular. And again, it's free and open source. So it's generally a nice thing to use. The M and P generally go hand in hand together, MySQL and PHP. So MySQL is the database server. So when we start building interactive sites, if you want users to be able to register an account within your application or want users to be able to submit information into your application, that information is going to have to be stored somewhere. So you need a database server to be able to do that. So MySQL is a popular choice because, again, it's free and it's open source, and it's used by a ton of different sites on the internet. It's incredibly popular. A couple years ago, Oracle, which is kind of like this huge company, they actually kind of bought out the rights to MySQL. They still keep it free and open source, but obviously that's caused a lot of worry in the open source community. So MySQL has actually been forked, and there's another version out of it now that exists called MariaDB. So you might see MySQL often referenced as Maria or MariaDB. And it's the same product. It's just a fork or a slightly different version of MySQL. But MySQL is incredibly popular because it's free and open source. And then, of course, we have PHP. PHP is a server-side scripting language. There are other server-side scripting languages that exist. So you might have learned how to use Python and INFOST 350. But there's also things like Cold Fusion and ASP and ASP.NET. There are a bunch of different ways or a bunch of different other server-side scripting languages that exist out there. In this class, we're going to learn how to use PHP. Generally, PHP doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one to other programming languages, but if you learn how to use PHP, you probably are going to be able to learn how to pick up Cold Fusion or Python relatively easy. So it's kind of like learning a foreign language. Once you learn one foreign language, you can pick up another one with relative ease. Of course, there's going to be a learning curve, but a lot of the core concepts translate very well to other languages. What's nice about MySQL is any SQL server is pretty much, it will be a one-to-one match. So if you're running Oracle, you can generally transfer an Oracle database to MySQL with relative ease. You don't need to make a lot of changes to your database because it all does SQL. So MySQL is well transferable to different database server technologies. PHP is not, but it's not impossible. So a lot of times developers might release their application with both a PHP version and like a Cold Fusion version as an example, because they're similar enough where you might be able to do that. So again, when you have Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP all running together, you have what's known as a LAMP server. So at SOAS, our LAMP server is virtualized, so it's not a physical server anymore. It's actually a virtual server that runs in essentially our in-house cloud on a service known as VMware. So we have VMware vSphere running in our data center on campus. The student website server is virtualized and it runs in our VMware environment. It lives down in the basement of EMS in the data center, and it's running there. And we use CentOS as the Linux distribution. You don't need to have a server necessarily to run a LAMP server. You can turn pretty much any computer into a server. So at SOAS, we have a server running in the data center using enterprise grade equipment, but if you're interested in installing a server at your house, you can use any old computer to do it, or you can run VMware on your existing computer at your house. There are a couple of different ways you can turn your computer at home into a LAMP server. So the easiest way would be to download one of these packages that will install and configure everything for you. So there are packages that exist out there that'll do this for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. You download an executable, you install it, and it does everything for you. It installs Apache, MySQL, PHP, and it configures all these components to work together. You can, of course, also download Apache, MySQL, and PHP separately from their development websites and manually install them. However, if you manually install Apache, MySQL, and PHP, by default, they're not going to work. You have to configure them to talk to one another. So if you're interested in being a sysadmin, a systems administrator, one really good thing you can do is manually download these packages and install and configure them yourselves. It's a really great way for you to understand how they're configured and how they really operate at a more intimate level. But if you just want to turn your computer at home into a web server, you can definitely check out these tools. XAMPP and WAMP and WinLAMP are three that I've used. And they all pretty much do the same thing, which is download a bunch of software and then configure it automatically. I will say if you choose to use one of these pre-configured packages, you have to be careful because this is going to turn your computer at home into a server. So what is a server? What is it intended to do kind of at a high level? Well, a server essentially will give users, which could be anybody in the world, access to data on your computer. So it's going to start serving out information. So when you turn your computer at home into a server, you're going to be opening up holes into your computer for people to access information. So what can be kind of dangerous with these servers is that if you install one of these pre-configured packages, you don't really know what it's doing to your computer. You don't know what versions of Apache, MySQL, and PHP are being installed. You don't know what security features are enabled or not enabled. And you don't know necessarily if it's going to be running all the time or only some of the time. So if you just install one of these, it might work, but you might be running a really outdated version of Apache or MySQL or PHP. So I mentioned that Apache, MySQL, and PHP are super popular. They power more than half the world's websites. And because of that, they're also huge targets for hackers to try to break into. So there are always different versions of Apache, MySQL, and PHP that are being released because hackers are constantly hitting it, trying to figure out different vulnerabilities and ways they can break into these different websites and services that power them. So if you install one of these easy to use packages, you don't know whether or not it's going to be installing the most up-to-date or recent version of Apache or MySQL or PHP. So you might not necessarily know what security holes exist. So you have to be careful about that. If you play around with these, it's definitely fine to do so, but just make sure that you're not running it all the time. So by default, a lot of these will run a web server on your computer all the time, which you probably don't need. You probably only need to run it when you're testing out an application that you're building. So just make sure if you play around with these that you stop the server after you're done playing and testing so it's not running all the time. Because again, they can open up a lot of security holes into a computer. The safest way to do this would be to install the software on a separate computer or in a virtual machine that's dedicated solely to just testing applications and serving out web documents. So that way, if it's hacked, it's not the end of the world. Your application might get hacked, but it's not like someone's going to be able to get to your taxes or your financial information that's also stored on the same computer that's being ran as a server. So keep those things separate if you can. And again, if you're trying to manually set up and configure a server, I definitely recommend it. It's a great way to learn how these different services interact with one another. It can really give you a lot of skills and give you essentially provide yourself with a lot of knowledge of how these different things work at a more intimate level. You can Google around like how to install Apache, MySQL, and PHP on CentOS or whatever distribution of Linux you're using, like Ubuntu, and you're going to find a bunch of different guides that exist. So as an example, you can click on this link, and there's a pretty short and straightforward guide to follow. So now we're going to go into an introduction and start talking about how PHP operates and do a couple of example scripts. This video has been going for about a half hour, so I think it's good if you want to take a quick break, refresh your cup of coffee, and I'll start the second video, or I'll take a break and I'll start this next portion in a second video. So take a quick break and stop back in for the second video in a couple of minutes.